I traveled to the other side of the world to live out a dream and to learn a lesson too. And that story is next. I'm Mike Quackenbush, this is Till We Make It, and if you are passionate about the craft of pro wrestling, and you're never done learning all about it, then you've landed in the exact right place, my friend. Go ahead and join the Till We Make It tribe. Subscribe down below and enable notifications so you never miss out. Today's video is part of my series, Icons and Insights, in which I'm going to share with you wisdom I've gleaned and lessons I've learned from experiences with true superstars of professional wrestling throughout the years. I really believe that it's important for every wrestler to choose both short-term and long-term goals for their career. Those short-term goals, the ones that might be relatively easy to accomplish, well, they're going to supply some forward momentum to help catapult you toward the achievement of those long-term goals. And you may or may not know, my ultimate career aspiration was always to wrestle in a Super J Cup tournament, the most prestigious wrestling tournament for junior heavyweight wrestlers. And given my age, the reality is I'll probably never realize that dream. But along the way, I've had other goals, one of which happened to take me 13 years to accomplish. When I broke into wrestling back in 1994, I set some short-term goals for myself. One of them was I wanted to win a championship title. I thought it would be really validating. And just between you and me, it kind of was, but also kind of wasn't. But I also set some long-term goals for myself as well. And the big one was wrestling in Japan. It took me from when I broke in 1994 all the way to the autumn of 2007 to actually get there. And as my tour with Michinoku Pro in the northeastern part of Japan was coming around, I suffered one of the most severe concussions of my entire career. Now, in the years since, our understanding and appreciation of the severity of concussions has changed quite a bit. But back in 2007, the reality is we understood that a whole lot less. If I was faced with the same decision now that I had to make back then, I don't know that I would make the same choice. But against doctors' orders, I decided to fly to Japan, even though I was told this would not aid in my recovery from the concussion whatsoever. The pressure of being in a cabin traveling at 30,000 feet for nearly 20 hours was doing no favors to the injury I had suffered. As a longtime fan and devotee of all things Michinoku Pro, the chance to actually go and wrestle for this organization was like a dream come true to me. And so, despite the fact that I did have diminished cognitive function because of the concussion I had suffered, the prospect of postponing or canceling this trip abroad was never even considered, not by me anyway. The sad reality is, because my brain was still healing from that injury at the time, there are whole parts of that trip I don't remember. And I look back at some of the photographs I took while I was there, and I have no memory to associate with those images. Once I actually made it to Japan, well, I learned pretty quick how lonely of an experience it can be. I was the only English speaker on the tour. I was also the only American on the tour. And my Japanese is grade school level at best, beyond which I was still coping with all the physical symptoms of the concussion that I'd suffered. And the whole affair actually turned out to be a tad bleak. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. The parts of Japan that I got to see and still remember, whether it was big cities like Tokyo or out in the rural areas, all of it was beautiful. And everybody else on the tour, well, they weren't impolite or unprofessional or anything like that, but it was very difficult to overcome that big language barrier. In addition to which, there was a bit of culture shock for a North American being in Asia the very first time. And as a guy who doesn't eat fish or any kind of seafood, because if it swims in its own toilet, it does not go in my mouth, I quickly discovered that I had not packed enough protein bars to survive this tour. Apart from the overt cultural differences between the United States and Japan, there were also differences in the wrestling culture, some of which I was learning for the very first time. For example, here in the US, it's not uncommon after the ring is erected and the show space prepared for those helping to set up to leave the venue, go grab a bite to eat, and then return for call time. But at Michinoku Pro, this was not the case whatsoever. Once the show space was prepared, no one left the venue. That is not part of the culture. You stay there. And that became a problem for the guy who burned through his protein bars way too fast and had expected that he'd be able to leave the venue and find some lunch. And that meant I had nothing to eat on the day of my Japanese debut. I was wrestling in Takazawa Mura that night, and I was there as the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Champion. For all kinds of reasons, personal ones and professional ones, I needed to make a great first impression. And it seemed like I was going to have to do it on an empty stomach. Well, wouldn't you know it, about an hour before the doors were set to open, a food truck happened to come to the venue selling boxed lunches, bentos, and so a bunch were brought into the locker room. And I thought, thank goodness, I don't want to try and go out to the ring on an empty stomach, especially given everything else that I'm coping with right now. But what I discovered was all of these boxed lunches contained fish. And you might recall your old pal Mike has a really hard rule about fish. And so I opened mine up and poked around, ate one tiny little compartment of rice, and then realized, I think that's it. I don't think there's anything else in here I can possibly eat. I've just had 3 chopstickfuls of rice. That's what I'm eating today. But my plight did not go unobserved, because the most famous wrestler there and the founder of Michinoku Pro, the Great Sasuke, took note that I wasn't really eating. And so, unbeknownst to me in that moment, called aside one of the greenhorns, one of the rookies, and sent them out of the venue on a mission. A half hour later, that kid came back with a beautiful pink bakery box, which he handed over to the Great Sasuke, and then Sasuke brought and presented to me, filled with, I don't know how, a whole lot of my favorite foods. That day in Takazawa Mura, the Great Sasuke taught me a really important lesson. And even now, years after the fact, while parts of that trip are shrouded by the fog of failing memory, that experience I had with Sasuke remains crystalline in my memory. I was an absolute outsider in that locker room. I had never toured with Michinoku Pro before. I barely spoke the language. And for his part, Sasuke had a lot on his plate. He had to make sure that his corporate sponsor for that event was satisfied. He had 1,100 paying customers jammed into that venue, all of whom deserved a great show. And he himself had to prepare to perform in the main event match. And yet, he still found a way and took the time to make the outsider in his midst feel welcome. And although a lot of time has passed, that gesture still means a lot to me. In there is a lesson we can all benefit from. Those simple gestures, the way in which we make the outsider in a locker room feel welcome, can have a profound and lasting effect. I think pro wrestling works best when we all come together to make something greater than the sum of our individual parts. One great wrestler by herself doesn't make an entire event great. One great ringside manager by himself does not make an entire card great. But when we all come together through the greater fraternity, the brotherhood of pro wrestling, to showcase each other's talents, we bring that magic to the stage. And it's simple gestures, like the one the Great Sasuke made toward me in Takazawa Mura on October 12th, 2007, that allows us to connect when we welcome everyone into the ensemble as an equal and appreciated part of the team. It's simple acts of kindness like that which foster a sense of team unity by making even the outsider feel like they are part of the group, beyond which it's also how we connect as human beings. After that tour of Michinoku Pro, it was 4 years before I saw the Great Sasuke again, but when I did, He remembered that evening and that experience with the exact same clarity that I did. If wrestling from Michinoku Pro is new to you, I don't mind gushing a little bit. My favorite match of all time is a Michinoku Pro match. In fact, I talk about it in a video on this channel that's appearing over here right now. Or if today's insight has inspired you to want to be a better locker room diplomat, well, click on the video appearing down here so you can keep on learning.